Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Generative AI in Medicine, Discovering Opportunities, Challenges, and Best Practices. On behalf of Becker's Healthcare, thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, I'm going to walk through a few quick housekeeping instructions. If you have any questions or thoughts for our panelists during today's session, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box on the left side of your screen. Our session is also being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link you used to log into today's webinar to access the recording. If at any time you don't see the screen moving or have trouble with the audio, try refreshing your browser. You can also submit any technical questions into the Q&A box. We're here to help. With that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Enrique Estrada. Enrique, take it away.
Thank you, Sydney. And thank you to Becker's and everyone here that's part of this discussion today. Really excited to have what I would call kind of this conversation that's front and center with our industry, both healthcare and life sciences, and that is, where does the role of AI and Gen AI have in healthcare today? And more importantly, what are we going to do to drive the outcomes and the efficiencies and drive that access to care that's really important to our patients and our customers? So today, what I want to do first and foremost is just start off with a round of introductions. I'll pass it over to our esteemed panelists who are experts in this area, and we'll start off with David.
Hey there, everyone. David Higginson. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at Phoenix Children's. I've been there about 12 years in a number of different roles with a lot of operations focus, and then really working in children's hospitals for 28 years. And Phoenix Children's, if you don't know, is one of the biggest children's hospitals in the country. We've had huge growth along with the city of Phoenix, and also being one of the youngest children's hospitals, we've really had to innovate and drive our research from a kind of a technical perspective versus that very traditional research you may have heard. So innovation is really kind of in our lifeblood, and we've still got that kind of startup mentality here at Phoenix Children's.
Great, thank you. Jim.
Hi, Jim Thomas with the City of Hope Cancer Care Center in Southern California. I've been with City of Hope a little over 6 years and served as Chief Technology Officer for the last 4+. City of Hope is a 110-year-old NCI designated comprehensive cancer center and about a $4 billion system that focuses on personalized care and treating cancer with leading edge technologies. We are in growth mode. We recently expanded to 3 new markets through the acquisition of Cancer Treatment Centers of America, and now operating in Phoenix, Atlanta, and Chicago as we become a nationwide system, and technology is certainly a large part of our growth. Great, glad to be here. Great,
thank you. Gurmeet.
Hello, everybody. Hi, Gurmeet Saran. I'm a practicing hospitalist and the Chief Clinical Data Science Officer for Common Spirit Health, second largest nonprofit healthcare organization here in the United States, encompassing over 150 hospitals, as well as over 2,000 outpatient care sites. Work very closely on our continuum of care, helping to use data to enable our quality and safety, both in the inpatient and outpatient settings, and looking forward to talking more today about some of the opportunities in Gen AI.
Yeah, indeed. And thank you for the introduction. So with that being said, let's just jump into the first kind of rounds of questions. So I think there was a LinkedIn Becker's poll that went out to all the healthcare executives out there. And 64% came back and said, absolutely, Gen AI has a role that can drive a really positive impact. Whereas you still have the rest that were saying it, not sure, maybe it's still a shiny object in the water. As I look at healthcare overall, everyone here has years of experience in the industry. We've always been known as the laggards, but I definitely think that we've started to drive faster innovation in healthcare. And looking at kind of the chasm, do you still believe that we are too early in this space to do something with Gen AI, or do you believe that there's absolutely an opportunity to operationalize AI? And maybe we'll start off with David.
Yeah, I think the first thing I'll say is, from a Gen AI perspective, I think we can all see the future. I think it's all quite clear once you spend time looking at Gen AI, how big of an impact it's going to have on many, many different industries. And so I think you'd be kind of crazy to bet against that. I am reminded of a phrase that says, kind of we overestimate what we're going to do in 10 months and underestimate what we're going to do in 10 years. And I think with Gen AI, that's probably a good yardstick for when we're going to see these huge changes. But I'm very positive about the future. I think in terms of looking for solutions that we're going to implement, in 3 months from now, I think we're still fairly much, based on what ChatGPT can do for the most part. I think vendors are rushing really hard to get those products out, but for all us in our industry, we have PHI and patient, safety and all those things to consider. And so it's just not possible to plug in a bunch of patient information to these public-facing tools today and use them practically day-to-day operationally. The last thing I'll say is, I think also operationally, it's quite an interesting challenge, because some of these changes, if you take kind of corporate positions that might be impacted, like educators, accountants, programmers, lawyers, there's no real impetus to go through that change yet. Everyone can see the opportunity, but there's nothing really pushing. And so we've had this kind of phenomenon. Yes, it's interesting. We can see as an opportunity, but if I don't have to do anything right now, let me just wait. And I think that's one of the things we're really gonna have to figure out, is how we get that impetus and find that place to get started. But overall, 100% believer in generative AI. It's just kind of how it's going to metamorphose itself into the operational environment.
Great, thank you. Gurmeet, what are your thoughts?
No, and I have to admit that, certainly I agree with David's first aphorism about, not underestimating where we'll be in 10 years. I certainly agree with that overall sentiment. I think speaking at large, just both at CommonSpirit, but even just in large in the healthcare industry, one of the fundamental questions, particularly in the clinical space, and David alluded to this around the PHI, is, how do we ensure that we're actually, whether we're looking at the data that we want to use to generate these insights, how do we ensure we're being respectful to the PHI, being HIPAA compliant? Obviously, doing this on an on-prem environment is I think first and foremost. And then I think the second part, which is very interesting, is how do you establish the governance around this? So whereas we may be seeing some questions around how do we ensure we have the technology portfolio, the ability to implement this, ensure that we actually have that downstream workflow put together, there's also so much preamble that needs to be done in terms of the governance, the compliance, the risk and safety. How do you ensure that you're vetting what that's going to look like? And to be fair, that's changing. I mean, we don't have good regulations coming from the government. We don't have good regulations coming from often even the industry outside of healthcare. So how do you sort of take that basic framework and start to think about putting that to paper and pencil, and then be able to actually go in, or paper and pen rather, and then be able to then go and take that idea and recognize, and this is probably the crux of it, that way we are governing this decision and thought process today will highly likely evolve and change over the next year or two. And so creating a governance that has some form of rigidity, but also recognizing that you need to have some malleability as you look out a year and a half, 2 years from now, because other concepts and ideas that we couldn't conceptualize will likely emerge from this space as well.
Yeah, and I think you hit on a really important topic, and I touched on this not too long ago. I think governance is really, really important in the planning of all this, and that governance model will probably continue to change. You can take a very broad stroke of what that looks like, but there's going to be so many aspects of what you're doing with clinical data, patient data, transactional data. And all those have different ramifications. And I'm not sure if anyone's noticed, but we're in a pretty regulated industry as it is. So, when it comes to HIPAA, PHI, and all those other things, we really have to pay a lot of attention to how we govern ourselves as an industry. And we can't wait for the government to do that. So great comment there. Thank you so much. Jim.
Yeah, I think as an industry, we're just scratching the surface. And as we discuss here, the possibilities we know are endless. I think as the technology advances and matures, the integration to healthcare, has the potential to improve patient outcomes, increase our efficiency as a labor force, and certainly accelerate the medical research. I know for my organization, the expectations is that we're curious, but that curiosity, I think, needs to move to formalize the exploration of these capabilities through supported and funded initiatives and programs. As you mentioned on the laggard statement, healthcare continues to play catch up apart from those platforms that we saw accelerate through the global pandemic because we were forced to, and we made it happen. But if you look at the average spend, especially given the current financial climate, we spend 60 to 70% of our budgets on keeping the lights on, probably another 20 to 30% on growth. But most of us are still in single digits on innovation, and we need to do more.
Yeah, great comment there. When let's kind of just dovetail into kind of like, we want to do more, and there's a lot of things we can accomplish, right? The technology is there, the data is there, whether it's payer, provider, clinical, or just these different determinants of health that are out there. I always like to, especially when there's new technology, how do we kind of set ourselves up for success? So maybe Jim, just to kind of lead with you, is when you think about what use cases or solutions that this can drive, what are some of the use cases that you're seeing right now at the City of Hope that you're kind of exploring or already implemented? And maybe talk to us about what those expectations have looked like, and has there been any limitations along with that?
Yeah, we think, some of the more immediate opportunities are to leverage our existing data sets, looking at patient data, our own data, electronic health records, medical imaging. We know Gen AI can help in identifying patterns and predictive disease outcomes, which obviously for cancer care is critical in cases leading to earlier diagnosis and being able to continue down the path of personalized treatment. One area in particular that we tackled through an applied AI model was sepsis, which impacts all of us in healthcare. It's a condition, commonly due to infection that can develop without warning and progress very quickly. So through a collaboration between IT and our Department of Hematology Oncology, along with Division of Infectious Disease, it led to, for us, a creation of an applied AI model for sepsis. The model's been in place for us just over 3 years. Patients are monitored on a regular basis as they would be normally. And machines give us a score of probability on sepsis. So it allows us to detect some of those things earlier, that can develop before the symptoms even become apparent. And the feedback from the AI model can certainly be life-saving. So those are some of the areas that we've looked at in conjunction with the acceleration that we've seen from Gen AI.
Yeah, let me touch on that, because I think you're doing something, and for the folks that are dialed in and are listening to this, you mentioned a couple things. You introduced different personas into the sepsis use case. You had folks from clinical, data, IT. You brought different groups of folks together to do this that traditionally probably wouldn't be part of your typical solution to go out to risk stratify or risk score a patient. So I think that's pretty important, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we mentioned earlier, it gives us an opportunity to collaborate at a different level that we may not do otherwise, either on a daily basis or through funded programs. And it's been great to see that collaboration across those groups that may not otherwise work together to solve what we're solving for.
Yeah, absolutely. Gurmeet, what about folks at Common Spirit, as far as how do you go after small wins or kind of stack your deck to have that confidence as you build more and more use cases with Gen AI?
Sure. So, part of this, going back to the governance piece, we do have a intake process in which we're developing to better assess, this shiny object, as everybody calls it. What is the actual value proposition that you want? So your a priori sort of understanding of how will Gen AI or an LLM be able to help us better assess the value that this organization needs to create, whether it's around quality, safety, patient experience, research, chart abstraction, back office rev cycle, supply chain management is a big one that people often are beginning to think about as well. But that I just laid out sort of every service line that is interested in this, and how do we ensure that we're not just sort of running and thinking that everything that looks like, you have a hammer, an LLM, and everything can look like a nail. And that's where there's often this conflation of, well, what is Gen AI versus what is sort of a predictive standard regression model or a standard AI model that doesn't invoke Gen AI opportunities either. So really trying to vet out what are the sort of initial use cases, having that intake process, making sure that we're actually doing a lot of due diligence on creating that front end throttling. So then we can take these ideas. And then once we have these ideas in place, we have that ability to triage the ideas and better understand, okay, well, this may or may not actually be a useful using an LLM or a Gen AI opportunity versus this is something where there's already a vendor out there that's doing this using a standard regression model, and maybe we should be approaching a vendor or building it in-house. So really sort of trying to vet out where we can actually see the branch points of the opportunities. Now, getting to more the Gen AI conversation, that's where we're starting to look at being very, very, very cautious around clinical opportunities right now. We recognize that is really the highest risk for any sort of healthcare organization as a whole. But are there some back office or back end operations that we can support using some of these modalities? And we talked about the rev cycle opportunity, looking into maybe is there some opportunity around prior authorization and opportunities, looking at the marketing and the outreach. So digital transformation, is there a possibility of using this type of technology to help with patient engagement or patient questions in the digital front door? And these are all just very, very sort of at the surface trying to talk about this, but part of it really is trying to get an inventory of where do we think we'll get the best initial value using this tool. And it goes back to that same comment I made just a minute ago, is it's so new and uncharted territory. Everybody thinks that a zero shot sort of Gen AI tool, given sort of what we've seen with ChatGPT-4, given what we see sort of in the market, that could be the end all be all. But we also recognize we need to actually create more customized and more grounded models, which is becoming, I think, the next part of the discussion when you talk to any of the large Gen AI companies, is how do you ensure you can take a zero-shot model, potentially go and feed it and do some prompt engineering to better understand, okay, how do we ground this more? How do we ensure that we're not confabulating or hallucinating? How do we ensure that it doesn't go off the rails and start saying, comments which we would otherwise not want it to say? And that's really the sort of beginning phases that we're trying to make sure we better understand before we unleash this in any of our sort of back office opportunities, and or as you start to look at actually front forward facing, customer facing or patient facing opportunities as well.
So what I think I heard is that absolutely leveraging large language models, but it sounds like because you're working across the organization, there's internal facing, enterprise facing components of Gen AI, as well as with the digital front door that you mentioned, there's a component for patient engagement and how you use that technology for patient engagement as well. What do you think the reception or the adoption looks like with your population? Do you believe that they're ready for this as well from a patient engagement perspective to embrace some of these services?
Yeah, difficult question. I can't say, just yet what that is, because we're still going through the opportunities of ensuring that we actually ground this and have sort of a models that we sort of trust and believe in for various use cases. When it goes back to our customers or in general, our customers or patients willing to engage with this, I think the simple answer is absolutely yes. I mean, we've been doing this with phone trees for the past 10, 15 years, when we used to call up, change airline reservations and, have those sort of terrible phone trees that existed 15 years ago. And you've seen that sort of slowly sort of become a little bit more commonplace. One of the more personal sort of anecdotes I have is, when you actually see patients coming into the hospital or even family members, very commonly people are engaging with Siri or engaging with their various phones to talk to them for directions or talk to them to answer questions. So voice is a very common methodology from which we can actually engage and interact. And that ability to say, okay, I can engage with somebody via voice or engage with somebody via an LLM and get a response back, maybe be it a computer response. I don't think that is at all outside the realm of sort of usability, because anybody that's very tech enabled nowadays is doing this, whether they're 8 years old, or whether they're actually 80 years old. So simple answer is yes, we are actually ready for this. And it's just a matter of ensuring we have the appropriate grounding.
Yeah, and I love that anecdotal reference, because if you think about those decision trees, or in my case, if I go back to my history with branching logic and look at clinical decision support, you had to walk down this tree and provide those systems to providers. But now you're not restricted just to this kind of small data set. You can expand it across all different types of cohorts of databases. David, just repeat the question as far as, low-hanging fruit and setting yourself up for success. What is Phoenix Children's doing?
Yeah, I think it kind of echoes what Jim and Gurmeet said. We all hear the people process technology three-legged stool that we have to look at every time. And I think when you have these new technologies, you often can't help yourself but get too excited about the technology. And I think Children's have been doing kind of machine learning and predictive modeling for 5 years now. And in that whole process, the number one thing I've learned is when someone, first of all, says, let's use AI on it, that's probably not that great of a solution. But the first question is, let's not talk about the model and the technology. Let's say, assume the model is 90% accurate. Tell me how you'd operationalize it. Because if you can't walk me through day to day what you're going to do with that score, why even bother building the model? I think you may have heard there was a statistic over the pandemic where a big academic university generated something like 92 different predictive models during that time. And a year later, not a single one was actually in use. And I think we have to be very, very careful that we don't get super enamored with the technology and the science projects and doing all that work. And then you come to actually, okay, now I've got it working. And you show up to someone who's our operational leader and they're like, that's great, but what the heck am I supposed to do? And so we've worked really hard with things. We have a malnutrition prediction, much like was Jim's describing with sepsis, where the algorithm actually is so good now that it puts the order into the EMR to order the consult by the nutritionist to go and check that patient for malnutrition because we're so confident with it. But prior to that, we didn't know how to implement it. We produced this list of patients we thought might have undiagnosed malnutrition. And the question is, okay, what do you do now? And so actually doing that last step of getting it into the EMR and building it into the process was really critical. And I think you can kind of play the same thing forward for generative AI. I kind of echo the statements. We are not at all looking at bedside generative AI right now. That's not where we're focused. The corporate back office areas, I think, are ripe for opportunities. But you have to kind of go with an area where if it doesn't get it 100% right all the time, it's okay. And I'll give you one example. We have actually in production in our ticketing system, we're using the Microsoft OpenAI API to take every inbound ticket and run it through a prompt that says, imagine you're an IT help desk professional, decide which of these 10 help desks you would send this ticket to. And then we have the text of the ticket and actually does the routing or the triage of the ticket. And if any of you worked in IT before, you know the help desk isn't always 100% accurate when they route a ticket that's coming internally. And we found that language model to be really, really good at doing that first pass routing. So you don't have to have a help desk person read through every ticket and route it to the right team. And I think those are very simplistic example about how we can do an assist, but the risk of failure there isn't huge. If it goes to the wrong ticket and someone punts it over to another group, we do that every day anyway. So that's not life or death situation. And I think, but there are lots of little wins like there where that technology will slowly get embedded through many, many functions that we do, probably, 5-minute functions that we normally don't think too much about, where now that cognitive load will be eased on a lot of people. And I think that's the difference with generative AI. It's kind of very approachable for the regular person. It's not some very esoteric, narrow approach that you have to do, which is kind of like machine learning is.
Yeah, and just to touch on that, I mean, you talked on a couple of things, one of them being adoption, right? I think we, especially in healthcare on the provider side, a lot of folks are very religious about their workflows and their clinical workflows. You really almost have just like one opportunity to nail it, right? So, because the last thing you want to do is disengage a provider or change that provider experience where they just don't want to use the tech. So I think you touched on that, and I think it's a really important note. And then the patient experience is super important as well. The other thing that you talked on or mentioned was implementation. And I think, if I think about a methodology, right, when we talk about implementing new technology, there's got to be some sort of structure, methodology, and how we do this. What has been, David, since you touched on it, what has been kind of your experience with the methodology? What have you chosen, or how have you kind of worked through that implementation model?
So we're pretty simple-minded. So first of all, I'd say this technology is very much a halo technology for us. It's not what we spend 90% of our day doing in innovation or IT. And so for those cases that come up, I actually take the lead role myself as someone who builds the models as well as has to operationalize them. And I start now very concretely with this idea is, okay, the AI sounds cool, but tell me, let's frame this problem up as a prediction problem first of all, because often, as you guys may have experienced, it's really quite hard to frame many problems up as predictions, and people aren't used to thinking that way. We're used to kind of optimizing workflows or an if-then statement. We're not very good at saying, okay, how would a prediction help me here? Especially if it's only going to tell me that it's not 80% or 90% likely to happen. Can you deal with, 1 out of 5 times it being wrong? And so we really, really overweight the discussion around the operational of it, and saying to people, okay, sit me down with the person doing the work and let them tell me exactly what's going to happen here. And if you can't explain it, we're not even going to go further with the model. And so we've just become very, very strict. That wasn't how we were day one. Believe me, there was a lot of hard lessons learned. Very early on, we were probably batting 1 out of 5 in terms of which models made it into production. But it became clear, just like you said, people's perception of AI and machine learning gets tainted pretty quickly. And if you have a lot of excitement and momentum around an idea, and then you do all that work and you find that it can't be implemented, people like next time. And I give you one last example, is like a clinic no-show algorithm. So I'm sure many people, this is an old chestnut, how can predict who's not going to show up for clinic? Well, we built a model that was really, really good at that, over 90% accuracy. And then the doctor said, well, what am I supposed to do? Okay, now I know this patient's not showing up, just have the nurse call them again. Well, we'd already been calling them for appointment reminders. That wasn't going to change anything. So, now can we overbook that patient with another one? Well, what happens if both show up? The doctor said, well, it's an hour-long appointment. Am I going to stay till 7 o'clock at night because both patients showed up? And you all know that 1 out of 20 times that's going to happen. And so really had to think through, what does it look like when the prediction works and doesn't work, and stop assuming that everything's going to be 100% all the time. And so I can't, really emphasize that enough. That is so important in trying to setting people's expectations. Otherwise, it's just another technology project that never makes it to the light of day.
Right. And it sits on a shelf, and good for you. You built something that's awesome, but no one's going to use it.
Right.
Maybe we can build a predictability model for a predictability model's sake. So, all right. What about you, Jim? What does the implementation models look like for City of Hope?
Yeah, I like what both David and Gurmeet said about, not chasing things, especially those that are clinical facing and have, a high potential of risk. So creating that governance, creating that intake model that looks at those use cases that we can learn from, but the risk is low. The other thing that I think is important, and we're sort of taking a step back, is we need to be intimate with our own data architectures, right? At all levels, we understanding the data sources, developing the integrated models to ensure standard intake. We've had such a data explosion in the last 10 years. So going from conceptual to logical data models and in the standard terms, while maintaining the integrity of what we might consider our master data. So I think as we look at that and those outputs from our data warehouses and data lakes, whatever we've created, the integrity of that data will then increase the value of those outputs, from machine learning to AI, Gen AI, what we're doing in the way of visualization, that ultimately leads to some of those real-time decision support, that we're envisioning, but that we're not starting with that in mind. So I think that's important for all of us to take a look at, because it's not just internal data. It's coming out of our sort of patient registries, but external data and working and collaborating with other institutions outside of what's getting produced from Gen AI. So I think that's an important aspect.
Right. And Gurmeet, you're the kind of the data scientist on this call, or at least how the folks that roll up into you, they're dealing with a lot of different data, a lot of different databases and data lakes and registries, what have you. What does the typical model look like for implementation on your side?
Sure. So, I echo exactly what Jim and David said, that the operationalization is, especially for a large community health-based system like us, is really where the opportunity, the value creation is. I mean, there's so much going on. Keep in mind, this whole Gen AI revolution was born out of academia just within, theoretically over the past 50, 60 years, but realistically, over the past, 4 to 5 years, we've seen this massive explosion. And you talk to the leading and, some of the people that wrote some of the seminal papers, and they don't really have a clear understanding of sort of how this technology and these LLMs have become sort of emergent and are able to do mathematics and are able to sort of understand and comprehend jokes and so on. And so I say this because for twofold. One to sort of help us all understand that we're not even in the first inning. We're maybe in the literally warm-ups right now of where this technology is going in terms of the start of where we're headed. And two, knowing that you're actually at this, you have these models or these sort of these specific LLMs that are over time going to drift and sort of create, hopefully become better and more refined. You want to ensure that you don't overbuild your technology stack to sort of just focus on where we're at today. And by that I mean, we're getting concerned about, well, what's the idea of how do we ensure that we're not going to get overcharged for inference? Because these models themselves, it's one thing if you sort of run it on a small cohort of 1,000 patients, but now if you're running this at scale, multiple models every day, you could actually, just by way of running so many LLM based models, have an inference costing problem. So total cost of just inference could become incredibly expensive. And now that doesn't even get into what Jim was also starting to talk about, is how do you ensure you have the robust infrastructure to manage these streaming data sets, the streaming inputs that are coming in. And so that implementation piece, so sort of getting and landing sort of this discussion back to your implementation question, we do have a large technology gap that, right now, many of the hyperscalers understand, but we're in the business of being a healthcare provider and a healthcare services industry. We have to assess and better understand what's going to be the happy medium from a technology infrastructure to ensure we can implement these solutions at scale. Because right now it's still very questionable of, even the economics of this per se work out if you're doing this across, thousands and thousands of models running at the same time.
Yeah, and the next question was actually going to be based off of barriers and challenges, and I want to talk about tech policy and process. But if we could just double click on what you just touched on, because you said something I haven't heard too much. Actually, I haven't even heard it mentioned in past conversations around Gen AI, and that is the overage component, right? And the data inferring, it needs to go out and scale and get more data from other places, in which basically incurs cost. Can you just talk a little bit more about that? Because I think CIOs out there, CTOs, that probably isn't something that kind of comes up too often. So if you can just double click on that a little bit more, that'd be great.
Sure. So I'm happy to sort of start this off, but we have some Jim B with his role, I'm sure, has some more sort of information around this as well. But it really just boils down to this concern that the way that we're operated as, I think, an industry at large with structured databases, and now we're moving into unstructured large scale data sets. Do we have not only the network topology to better sort of move this data around? Do we actually have the actual underlying data structures to house this? A lot of this work that we're starting to see is emerging around vector search, because you want to try to ensure you sort of confine the space of the search problem. And how do you start to look at sort of vector based databases that can actually enable sort of faster retrieval of data and do it at a, hopefully not a cost prohibitive scale. And then third, going back to what I mentioned, is just knowing that, you don't necessarily, training a model is one thing, fine tuning a model is another thing. Those are both incredibly expensive, right? I mean, obviously there's rumors that ChatGPT, cost, in the tens of millions, maybe even close to $30-40 million to train. I don't want to, spread any rumors, but that's what sort of you hear on the internet, which, you trust everything on the internet, as you know. And so with that said, I think the question is, how do you ensure that you're actually, once you have your fine-tuned model, how do you then ensure that there's sort of this underlying infrastructure to run this and not make sure you don't have anything that goes off the rails, and sort of you have a model that ends up, you make up the next morning and your FinOps person comes back and says, oh, you just ran sort of a $10,000 query just because something went off the rails. And I'll end with this maybe before I think Jim may have some more input on this as well. But, the CFOs are obviously getting concerned about, what does this look like overall? We recognize that today, if you had this much data, this is what the system will cost. In a generative AI world, you could 10x that data within one calendar year or one fiscal year. And then now you're actually having to scale the analytics by orders of magnitude. And so there's this question of how do you ensure that you're being prudent and judicious with your overall cost spend, particularly in this world of generative, you're generating more and more sums of data. So pause there. Yeah. And a lot of sort of probably takeaways from that. But Jim, I'm not sure if you want to add to that as well.
Yeah, certainly. I think about the context of build versus buy, and the answer is it depends. But when you think about regulation, certainly egress of data and the costs of where that data is moving at any given time. Our own organization, we're heavily dependent on data as Gurmeet, structured, unstructured, semi-structured. Some of our key programs that are focused on precision medicine and have significantly increased our data footprint. And that'll certainly continue as we look at things like synthetic patients and digital twin, and our ability to run those models against those data sets, right? Again, without impacting care. But Gen AI is going to demand reliability on those data sources to generate those new discoveries, those therapies, and ultimately those clinical decisions. So I think back to what I said earlier on just the importance of data integrity is paramount, but it's also caution and not getting too far over our skis. So I think just reinforcing what we're all saying is being able to do this in concept, before moving to formal implementation that has components of risk and really understanding it.
Yeah, and just a comment I'd make on the same two things. I mean, I think first of all, Chat GPT is a fairly unique situation where an extremely complicated and academic technology got exposed to the general public in a very simplistic and relatable way. And so it's very easy to be fooled that this is a simple technology and it's easy to implement because it's so easy to chat to the computer and get answers back. And so I think many people can underestimate the complexity and the size of the model, and the fact that realistically today there's only one company and one LLM that is really achieving that level of accuracy in their models, and the other ones are still catching up. And so when you try to implement that yourself, it can be really challenging, because we looked at a solution, open source, a Yakuna model that we were going to load all our policies and procedures up and allow people to interrogate the policies and procedures with an LLM. Well, you quickly, even if you're following the YouTube videos on how to do it, you quickly realize like some things just don't work, or it's changed from last week, or the model is not performant. Even though it sounds great, it's not performant yet, and you get really gibberish answers. And so I think very quickly you start peeling back the layers behind the technology that's very obvious to people. You realize there's a degree of immaturity, which I think everyone's talked about. There's a lot of cost involved with it, especially if you're kind of using a model on a per click basis. And it's just, a lot of very complicated science that's bundled up in something that looks very simple, which is great for the end user, but really hard for all of us when we're trying to replicate that and bring it to market. So, and the last comment I'd say is that even in the machine learning space, we are at that point where we're struggling with the kind of scale out, where we can build a model for predict one disease, and maybe it takes a day to go churn that data with a tool like Data Robot, but we have to have the data on premise for security, but you cannot scale that thing up. So when we're trying to now build 10,000 models, we're 2 months in and we're only 160 models down the path. We would love to go scale it up to like Microsoft OpenAI levels, but realistically, that's not plausible unless you move huge amounts of data to the cloud with all the costs and the security concerns. So I think we are at this kind of weird situation as we can see the future, but it's really hard to figure out how to operate it.
Yeah, let's talk about the future. Like, let's go down this happy path that all the scales there. We don't have the overage issues going on. Are we still talking about Gen AI in 5 years from now, or are we talking about interactive AI, or what is next? What do you see 5 years from now looking like, and what does that mean for the patients from an outcomes perspective? Maybe David, just go with you.
Yeah, I mean, what I think is probably going to happen is that the vendors are going to bring this technology and weave it into their product in very meaningful ways. And, ultimately, I've said this for a while, is I think the next big revolution in kind of electronic medical records is we ditch the keyboard and the mouse, and we get past that 1980s input mechanism, and we go to a much more natural style, which I think is this ambient listening, but not just dictation, because we were doing dictations back in the 1990s, and that was a known technology. But this ability for the technology to really listen into what's going on, determine whether it's the patient or the provider talking, tease out what the orders were and the documentation, and fundamentally then unchain the provider from the keyboard and the screen, let them have the conversation in a natural way and have most of the work done in the background. I think that's a nirvana, and as soon as somebody figures that out, which I truly believe we'll get to, the next whatever EMR you have today, you'll be getting a new one. And I think that will be the real huge thing that I think will make a big difference. And that same weaving of the technology into other business areas that are out there. And I think obviously programming, data analytics, if any of you use the tool from ChatGPT Plus, where you can load up a text file and interrogate it, it's kind of mind-blowing from a data analysis perspective. I think all of those uses of this technology embedded in products is really going to make a huge difference. And I think in 10 years, we probably even won't remember the work we had to do today to get simple answers. It'll just be so natural to us.
Right. And I truly hope that we do transform that whole provider-patient experience, because it's been monolithic and long overdue for as long as I've been in healthcare. Gurmeet, what are your thoughts? What's 5 years from now look like?
Sure. So, I definitely echo David's sentiment around the input of how we engage with the EHR will absolutely change within probably that 5 years. I'm a firm believer that voice technology, even without, let's say, the LM, just voice technology makes a lot of sense. Now you add to it the accretive ideas of being able to sort of add prescriptive sort of decision making along with it and interpretation. I don't think that that's actually going to be that far of a reality. The one part that I do worry about is, at what point is, even though these are open source technologies, is it going to become so difficult with so much data being generated? And we're focusing on some of the structured and unstructured data. There is a trove of pathology data, a trove of sort of genomics data, a trove of obviously radiographic data that, to be fair, to load that level of data in and to be able to run massive large scale AI on that, you begin to get concerned about, like I said, the cost, the technology, and are we going down a path where the open AI technology is still basically owned by the hyperscalers. So you're actually at this point, you're beholden to what, the 4 or 5, you can put them on your, name them all on one hand, what those companies are going to do in terms of sort of taking your data, holding it hostage, saying it's open source, but at the same time, because of this, the cost of running this, you may be actually at a point that it becomes very difficult to run this at scale. That's, I think, my concern, I'd say, that I see in the next 5 years. Hopefully there'll be some ways and we'll see some changes in the underlying the running and the inference of these models that will change and bend that curve. There's a lot of academics that are recognizing that you can't use silicon anymore to sort of keep going, past Moore's law. You need to start programming more sort of thoughtful ways of running this at scale. And I think you're having a huge amount of those data architects and engineers at these large organizations working on that. So that makes me optimistic. Getting it back to the use case, though, so one is around the input technology. I think voice is going to be very large. We talked about. 2, I still worry about the cost and who's going to be where and who's going to be running this data. And then 3, I still, I think for me, one of the most interesting ideas is still around summarization of data. There's a litany of sort of, I think, opportunity here where if we can start to take the generative AI, by definition, is going to continue to generate more and more data. And so how do we, as in the human mind, are we able to cognate that in a quick manner and be able to summarize that in a way that's going to be efficient? We can take what I wrote, what David wrote, maybe what a generative AI post wrote 2 months ago, aggregate that and summarize that, and do that, whether it's actually for usage in the legal field, whether it's usage for actually clinical summarization, whether it's even just trying to take the information back and feed it back to the patient and say, do you agree with what we talked about during this patient visit? There's ample opportunity there that will probably become pretty profound in the next couple of years as well.
Great, thank you. And Jim, maybe just before we get to our last question, maybe because you City of Hope focuses on cancer, very patient-centered healthcare delivery. Can you talk to us what that future would look like for people struggling with cancer?
Yeah, I mean, one word comes to mind, and it's really around cures, right? The biggest promise in our ability to accelerate those discoveries as a cancer research and treatment facility, right, to lead to that improved treatment and then in our case cures. So I think it's going to be an iterative process. It's going to require focus. It's going to require labor, funding, sponsorship, and more importantly, I think clear objectives for the organizations that are pursuing Gen AI and related technologies. Right now, for a lot of us, it's it's a pet project. It's something we're doing on the side. It's, we're not all in. We're, I'll use that word that I used earlier. We're curious about the possibilities. And there's, back to what we were talking about earlier on the call trees, there is some interesting work that's being done with contact centers, which I think is low risk as we interface with patients, and in some cases, new patients. We're able to take and supplement those script-based interactions with generative AI and the ability to engage and respond to some of those real-time conditions in the conversation. And that's, that becomes a satisfier for the patients, right? It's a different interaction than just reading through a script, getting stuck on the same question, or getting transferred, and now you're going through the same set of questions. So how do we eliminate some of the redundancy in that has become dissatisfiers for that? And then I'll just key in on what we said earlier with, I think David mentioned it on the ambient, right? I think we're calling it ambient clinical intelligence or something along those lines. Voice enabled, better documentation of the patient encounter, that free flowing conversation. And we have seen some positive impact on that from a care delivery perspective. That, again, I think is low risk. It's saving time on those encounters. It's addressing some of the quadruple aim in reducing, the burnout and fatigue that providers and clinicians are still feeling. So I think there's a bit to explore there. But again, I think those are, lower risk use cases that we're already seeing being integrated, as we mentioned earlier, into into some of the technology that's being developed and sold.
Great, thank you. The last question here, as we kind of wrap up, we covered a lot, and so thank you for kind of the full spectrum of what to think about. As we think about people that are tuned in and listening into this, everyone from an engineer to an executive to a clinician, and everyone that's part of providing care and supporting care, what is maybe the question I didn't ask that you want people to kind of walk away with, and the answer to that? Maybe Gurmeet, if you can go first, of what is it you want people to know?
Sure. So, for me, one of the big questions is, if we all do believe that in the next 5 to 10 years there'll be a large opportunity around these generative AI models and LLMs, I'm concerned about, do we have the workforce, and are the actual education systems we have in place going to be able to educate people fast enough for this new technology and this new wave of opportunity? And by that, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, this technology didn't exist. You could arguably say that the general populace didn't know about this until 11 months ago. And so how do we ensure that we're creating a workforce structure that enables us to be able to recruit that talent, within the younger talent, bring them up to speed, or have them up to speed very quickly, so that they're not sort of having to go and get re-educated, with this new technology once they get onboarded to the organization. So I'm concerned, not to end on sort of a negative note, I think that, that's still a positive. I think that we just need to have that true discussion with the commercial space, industry at whole, with the academic space, to make sure that they're aligning with where this opportunity is going, and doing it in a way that actually the data science programs, the statistical programs, the people that are going to be doing prompt engineering, let's say in the short term, how all of that aligns with the industry needs at large. And I talk about this broadly, not just with healthcare as a whole.
Great, thank you. Jim?
Yeah, I think, the future state is that it becomes more than just the skunk works, right? That we're actually applying, funding, that we're formalizing our sort of entrance into that. I think back, from a technology and infrastructure, when, we talked a lot about orchestration and automation. And then the question always on the other side of that was, well, we're going to do all these things to free up time so we can focus on more strategic things and get away from, the utility and the operational things that are labor intensive. But we never really answered the question of, what are those things that we're going to be working on? So I think this is one of those things that we are going to be working on. So we need to, as Gurmeet said, formalize our entrance into that, look at, retooling and retraining the labor force. I know there's a lot that's happening out, across all the industries, where those that are sort of at their own pace, becoming the experts in these, but we haven't built any really framework around what that looks like from a career path and staffing and training and all those things. So, we need to think about the future state on that as well. And then, continue to, adopt and start to formalize as we see this, or as we align to our own organizational objectives.
Great, thank you. And David?
I think the question I get asked all the time that didn't come up today is, how am I going to guarantee that the answers are right every time from these large language models? And the thing I try to explain to people, this is not like a big formula of things where there's a list of things that are right or wrong. This is no different than us hiring a 22-year-old out of college who kind of came in the top 5% in every subject that they took, but they really don't have much experience yet. And so think of the tool like that. You would never, ask a 22-year-old to write a policy that will go to the board of directors without anybody looking it over, but you would be really beneficial if they were helping you in that task. And so I think how we frame this technology to people and how they think about it is really important, because it is never going to be that quote right or wrong answer. It's always going to be something that instructs us in the way that we do things. And just the same way as Jim mentioned, encouraging people to be curious. We encourage people, and people find a way to use the browser every day to interact with the internet. And I think that's the same way that you can use ChatGPT to interact with generative AI. Encourage people to go try it out, figure out how they can make their jobs better. We don't regulate. I mean, Jim doesn't say today, this is how you have to use Google. You can only use it this way. I guarantee everything result you get back from Google is going to be 100% right. So, I've put my stamp of approval on it. And I think we have to kind of think about this technology at the moment in that way. But just the same way, eventually, when the internet gets baked into the products that we use and the decision making, then we have obviously this big requirement to make sure that it's safe and secure and we're doing the right things with it. But just can't overemphasize, I think, the need for curiosity and to really try and figure out how this technology is going to be used.
Great. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for all your insights. I think what I love most about this conversation is the applicability and how practical it is. All of you are really at the front lines of deploying technology, leveraging it, governing how we use it, and thinking about the future. So thank you all for the conversation and for the information out to our audience. With that being said, I will pass it back to Sydney.
Guys, that is all the time we have for today. I want to thank all of our panelists for such an excellent discussion, and VMware for sponsoring today's webinar. To learn more about the content presented today, please check out the resources section on your webinar console, and don't forget to fill out the post-webinar survey. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you have a wonderful afternoon.